Okay.
Life.
Hello and welcome to the fourth in our series of architecture and philosophy. This is in fact our third series of architecture and philosophy on digital futures. This is part of our Doctoral Consortium initiative, an initiative that was set up in order to create a shared platform for doctoral students and young academics across the globe, and would-be PhD students, so that we can share resources rather than having individual professors with small groups in small classrooms. Everyone can come together on a single platform. And we've had a very interesting series of sessions so far this semester. And it all stretches back to a moment 2 years ago when we had the great Slavoj Žižek kick off the entire series. Today, we're delighted to have a young and up-and-coming academic, originally from Turkey, from the Technical University of Istanbul, who came across the States, completed a very thorough PhD on Spinoza at Cornell University, and is currently teaching at Pratt, Parsons, and Cornell itself. I'm no expert on Spinoza, so I'm going to leave it all to Gökhan to introduce this topic. Gökhan, it's fantastic to see a young up-and-coming academic such as you working on these topics, and we look forward very much to the session. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Neil and Michael. I appreciate the architecture and philosophy series. I was just telling Michael that this field is almost endangered right now, and we need to be careful about it, protect it. Spinoza is, today I'm going to give you a lecture called Spinoza and Architecture. He's usually referred to as the renegade Jew who gave us modernity, by Rebecca Goldstein, for instance. But actually, his heterodoxy runs deeper. He offered us an alternative modernity, if you will, different from those of Descartes, Newton's, and Kant's, and what have you, and we didn't unfortunately take it, against both, to give you a very short summary of it, against both the God-centric conservatives and human-centric moderns of his time. He offered us a new way of thinking that centers the entire cosmos, or existence, or nature, whichever term you would like to choose, and suffered major consequences for doing so. So a very good way to introduce him is just to read this Charam from 1656 that excommunicated, and that was used to excommunicate Spinoza at the age of 23. So I'll just read it without comment so that you can see how how radical he must have been to receive such a harsh excommunication, let's say, excommunication statement. By the decree of angels and by the command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. So this is the more, let's say, performative part. The practical part is this one, which would be devastating for Spinoza. No one should communicate with him, not even in writing, not accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor come within 4 cubits in his vicinity. You cannot even come close to him. Nor shall he read any treatise composed or written by him. So this is the gentleman that we are dealing with. We're going to see what kind of dangerous ideas he was really generating at the time to receive this. I want to talk about his reception a little bit before I go into unpacking his philosophy. despite, of course, being excommunicated, and maybe we can also say that he could not have published anything after that under his name, and even posthumously, all his publishings would be banned. And they're talking about a gentleman who survived an assassination attempt as well. So very, very, tricky period in his life, but he was received afterwards, especially by the underground thinkers, very well. So in terms of ontology and epistemology, we can talk about Leibniz being very influenced by the Enlightenment thinking, Diderot and Knowles. By the 19th and 20th century, Goethe is famously known to have been carrying always the Spinoza's Ethica book in his pocket, even when he was, going on walks. Nietzsche's, Schelling's, Schopenhauer's, the process philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead, and especially in the post-war and contemporary period, Simondon and Deleuze Deleuze deemed him the prince of philosophers, if you recall. In arts and aesthetics, again, novelists Schiller, Blake, William Blake, the Romantics for the most time, Shelley, Büchner, Goethe, Hölderlin, 20th century Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, all the greats of modern literature, if you will. Post-war and contemporary writers like Clarice Lispector, science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick, deemed Spinoza his favorite philosopher, Borges and Miro. In terms of political theory, we are talking about radical democratic thought and French Revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then early Marx, Engels in terms of socialist and communist theories, and Proudhon and Bakunin in terms of anarchism, if you will. And since the 1960s, May 68, Occupy movements, bottom-up movements, post-war Marxism, post-war anarchism, all the radical, let's say, political movements. Ethics, Lemaitre, Nietzsche. There is a feminist Spinozism of the Australian school, if you're interested in their connection. In ecology and nature, early romanticism and Enlightenment materialism, very important. Naturphilosophie of the German tradition, Emerson and the transcendental generation in the United States. Post-war ecological movements, Arne deep ecology, especially lately animal and natural rights, ecofeminism, environmental ethics. Spinoza is becoming a big name here. They're rediscovering him, so to speak. And in terms of science and technology, he was a lens maker at the time. When he was excommunicated, that was how he earned his life, right? He was creating lenses for microscopes and telescopes, part of the rationalist and Enlightenment movements. And then mathematicians like Minkowski's and Cantor's were very interested in his conceptions of infinitude, and Einstein, Vygotsky, Freud, and lately the questions of extended and embodied mind and effective neuroscience again are rediscovering him. All that is to say, I'm sure you would be interested in, if not all of these topics, right? Multiple of these. So Spinoza will have very interesting to say and uncannily contemporary things to say about these in untimely jumps, as Nietzsche. So the tricky part of this, of course, is architecture. Being the conservative discipline that we have is not really a part of the game yet. Hopefully this can be an introduction into this missed encounter. My format, my modus operandi will be to synthesize for you the entire oeuvre of Spinoza. He wrote 9 books, most of them collected in his opera Posthuma. I will bring different directions and different conceptions from each and every one of them for you. There will be 4 sections. I'll talk about ontology and epistemology, and then go to physics and dynamics, ethics, aesthetics, technology, politics, and ecology. And what I will do is I will jump from one concept to the next. I will use them as stations, if you will, to create this journey so that we can see how a philosophical system as intricate as Spinoza's is built by these conceptual configurations. And I will have what I call architecture scholia. Scholium is a technique that Spinoza used in his Ethica whenever something was too heavy and intricate, he would explain it further with scholium at the end of every definition. So I will put these whenever I think there is an important implication for architecture, I will talk specifically about that so that our audience who are into architecture and design can better understand, let's say, the ramifications. Starting with ontology and epistemology. And I will read most of the things from the screen so that people can follow easily. Spinoza argues that we constantly misconceive the problem of generation. And this is a very important question. You can also say creativity or creation for this. Generation of being will be related to this, which is ontogenesis. Formation of the cosmos is related to this, cosmogenesis. And emergence of form, which is very important for designers and architects, or morphogenesis, let's say, are all related to this question. How does generation work? How do we generate, or how something is generated? Yeah. And he says that we fall victim to the bewitching allure of a very specific concept that he calls transcendence. Transcendence operates through three movements. First, it situates the creative dimension outside the created, so it is exterior. Then it assigns all the generative agency to the creative dimension. So there is a unilaterality, which means one-directional generativity. One direction has the entire agency of creating, while the other one remains passive, right? And it elevates the creative dimension like above in terms of its essence and value. So there is a superiority involved with this as well. If you look at a creative process from the viewpoint of transcendence, whatever is creating it will be superior to whatever is created, if you will. A few examples for you to better understand. For instance, in Platonic forms of transcendence, ideas, his famous concept, idea, right, exist outside the cosmos. They're exterior to this world. They possess unilateral formative agency. They form whatever we have on this actual world, and they are deemed superior. They are the ideals. That's why we are even in English today using idealism, ideals, as something that we always need to run after, but unfortunately can never reach. In scholastic modes of transcendence, which means the medieval European system in which Aristotelian and Platonic philosophies were merged with, let's say, the Christian and religious doctrines. God, the anthropomorphic God, as we know, resides in a supernatural dimension, right? It is exterior, it's not of this world, God. Creates the cosmos from nothing. If you remember the very first verse, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and is deemed superior to all its creations. And then you can talk about this in terms of modern transcendence. You can think about human reason. You can talk about economic systems. We have never left this behind. The point is, it's not just about Plato's or Christians. We are still mostly embedded within this mode of thinking when we think about creation. So there's a transcendent principle at the very top, and it creates everything from above and beyond while being superior to it. Right? This is the way it is. So he launches rigorous critiques of all these forms of transcendence, Platonic, scholastic, and modern. By modern, I mean Descartes and Bacon's of his time. The scientific, let's say, method was really invented in 17th century. The early moderns that we know, he critiqued all of them together. And he said the problem of generation or creativity needs to be addressed differently with a concept that is very notorious that he calls immanence. Right? So I will have to introduce two different concepts to make you understand what that means. He develops immanence as a special relationship between two other concepts, one of which is substance, substantia in Latin, and the other one is modalities, modus. Substance is the generative continuum underlying all disparate beings. It is an infinite topological field, if you will, to use modern terms, whose never-ending modifications express themselves in the emerging, enduring, and fading away of a plethora of finite topographical features. It is the substanding dimension. That is where it takes its name from, yes, of infinite potential, as Spinoza calls it, infinita potentia, through which countless finite beings, all of us, come to exist. So if you want to draw parallels from today's science, for instance, this would be the fields, the fields theory in physics, quantum fields or conventional fields theory, in which all particles are agitations or expressions of underlying fields, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, etc., etc. In short, for Spinoza, substance is life causing its own being, nature determining itself with infinite self-modifications, and the cosmos unfolding itself without the need of any extrinsic reference. It's the potentiality of the entire cosmos that is always being actualized in one way or another, right? And modalities are us, are the determinate modifications. This is the technical formal definition, affective condensations of substance. As humans, buildings, tornadoes, all these seemingly separate, let's say, configurations, right? And individuals, we are finite modalities in a durational existence. So if this technical term modality or modus, it means manner, it means way, it means mood, it means rhythm, all of which have very different beautiful connotations. As finite modalities, we constitute ever-changing manners and rhythms of the cosmos. We are all unique ways, different moods, singular pulsations of life. And it's a very beautiful way of thinking. You think yourself as a mood of the cosmos, right? You usually don't think of it that way. So nature has two dimensions. This means on the one hand, you have substance, on the other modalities. Nature is one from the potentiating viewpoint of this conjunctive substance. It brings everything together. Nature is many from the actualizing viewpoint of disjunctive modalities. From the viewpoint of you and me and my coffee cup, we are all this plethora, infinite ways of expressing this potentiality. So there's a single ocean, if you will, and there's 1,000 waves that are on top of it. There is a single unformed morphogenetic matrix, and there are a myriad distinct forms. And this is what Spinoza says in Ethica. I'm giving a direct quote: "Nothing exists except substance and modality." So it is as simple for Spinoza as this. Of course, it will become very complicated very soon, but this is the starting point. So immanence then is this generative relationship between substance and modalities. It's not substance causing it, or it's not modalities causing it. It is the relationship between them. So it is two-sided. It is as though you have this underlying potentiality and you have this, above ground differences, and they express and impress into each other, right? And that is immanence. That is how generation of creativity, of generativity works. Substance, immanence as the coming to being of those potentials, and then we have the everyday, let's say, life, the casual, banal life that we are part of. So let's do the same for Spinoza's immanence so that we understand the difference of it from transcendence on 3 conceptual moments. First, if you look from the viewpoint of immanence, it situates substance and modalities inside the same reality. So it is interior. It is interior. It is no longer in a supernatural, otherly dimension, right? It is here and now. The cosmos, the potentials are already embedded within the cosmos, not outside of it. So each pervades the other from within, yeah? Second, the immanence carries generative agency across all parties. So there is multilaterality, if you will, rather than unilaterality. Now, every modality, every creature is already creative, because every wave is already the ocean, right? The wave is not apart from the ocean. The wave is the ocean. And insofar as the wave is the ocean, it means it's creative. It's generative. So there is no big difference now. Third, immanence grounds both dimensions on equal footing, yet with distinct roles of potentiation and actualization. So they have different roles, but there is no, let's say, superiority between them, no longer like gods and, creatures. So through Spinoza's immanent lens, Generativity is no longer the one-off result of a godly figure or an external source, but the perpetual expression and everlasting mutability of nature's overlapping dimensions of modality and substance and its internal force. Right? So this is a very radical, let's say, approach in the 17th century and even today. And the most famous and infamous, let's say, terms that he uses about this, it comes from the Ethics Book 4. In the preface, then he says, Deus sive Natura, Deus sive Natura. This will get him into a lot of trouble because this means God or nature. Deus means God. Seu or sive, it means or, and Natura means nature. God or nature. And if you think about this, seemingly innocence of these three terms, God or nature, but then think about the consequences of what he's trying to do here. It is something very unorthodox. He uses this artful strategy. Instead of rejecting God altogether, he redefines God like a Trojan horse tactic, if you will, subtly from within, with the indefinite equality of sive, or with the simple grammatical seemingly conjunction of or. God remains no longer the God or Abrahamic theology, a transcendent monarch, judging humanity, promising heavenly rewards and threatening with hellish punishments, right? God turns into underlying potentials of the cosmos. God changes into infinite generativity of life. God becomes nature. Right? And this is why they never forgave him back at the day, and still today. He's still excommunicated, and it's not yet lifted, if you will. So these are the three concepts that we immediately kickstart: immanence, substance, modalities, and God or nature. The very, very core of Spinoza's philosophy. And then there is the concept of Heterarchy. In parallel with our transcendent worldview, Spinoza argues we also misconceive the problem of the distribution of being and value, how we, see different beings and different values when we look around us, falling victim now to another concept that is called hierarchy. Right? Hierarchy. It means this hieros comes from the ancient Greek divine or sacred, and arche means origin, power, method of government. Hierarchy means a vertical distribution of power, right? According to an immutable partition regarded as sacred and divine. So it is fixed, unchanging. It is the way it is because it's God-given, or it is as is in nature. There'll be some of the arguments. In the long history of Western thought, from Aristotle, Plotinus, Augustine, and Descartes to Linnaeus, Kant, Heidegger, and even Stephen Hawking, if you will, canonical modes of distributing being and value have been all grounded on hierarchical structures like theocentrism and anthropocentrism. Theocentrism is in God is at the top. In anthropocentrism, it's the humans that are at the top, right? In which a transcending apex, God or man, is situated at the very, top of this chain, followed by usually animals, and then there are plants, and then you have non-organic things are pushed to the very bottom. And if you think about how we still value things around us, today, although it's a bit changing in the last 2 decades, you would see that this is still embedded in our minds. This is our default mode of thinking, if you will. Opposing this canonical given, Spinoza insists, and I'm going to give quotes, not only that God has no special kingdom over people, right? So he immediately rejects that, a God-given hierarchy, but also man does not constitute in nature a kingdom within a kingdom. So the men are also not at the top of this hierarchy. He challenges both conventional theocentrism and modern anthropocentrism at once. This is Spinoza abolishing, if you will, hierarchy as such. So his vision is very different. His cosmovision is very different. Grounded no longer on hierarchy, but on what I would call, this is not a term he uses. This is a term that I call a modern term, which is heterarchy, because heteros comes from different and other, no longer God-given, and something vertical, and arche is still power. So heterarchy means that every modality exists as heterogeneous gradations of the horizontally distributed continuum of being, again, like waves of the ocean, right? You rise and fall. You're not static, but it's always ever changing, and no wave is superior to any other wave just because at some point of their life they can, rise higher than the others. There are no monarchs or castes of being in Spinoza's system. Nothing is privileged or elevated by essence. Nothing is more intrinsic word of existence. Being is equal for all, whether humans, animals, plants, buildings, quarks, or stellar systems. This is very radical, even for today, for his time. And a quick warning, equality does not mean sameness. This does not mean that all modalities are same and interchangeable with one another. Each modality is singular from the viewpoint of its harboring and enacting one-of-a-kind potentials, yet equal with all the others from the viewpoint of being or expressing the continuous generativity of life. So it doesn't mean a homogeneous flatness, right? That's not what we are going for here. It is an heterogeneous, let's say. There are differences, and we are not equal despite our differences, but because of them. So nothing is inert, passive, subordinate in this hierarchical worldview. This is, again, from Ethics, Part 2, Proposition 13, and it's scholium, as you can see here. He has very beautiful words. He says, all individuals are alive, animata, albeit in different gradations. Very beautiful. This is usually mistranslated as degrees, in different degrees, but a gradation is something very different from degree. Because a degree is in a quantitative system, it is like 4 is, larger than 3, whereas a gradation, you need a continuum. It's like a gradation of heat. So there's a topological system. There are differences, but it is still part of a continuum, if you will. It's not separate. So first, architectural scholium. What is at stake for architecture here when we talk about these very high concepts? The very being of architecture, the very life of design modalities are at stake, if you will. What I mean by this is that through hierarchical lenses that we usually deploy, architectural constructs are exiled to the very bottom of an abyss of being. They are rendered devoid of agency. They don't have any agency or life of their own, right? They are lifeless, dormant, wordless. They are diminished to the least significant of all beings, unless you're an architect and you value them very much. In general, this means, they're at the very bottom. They're at the very depths of being. But through Spinoza's hierarchical lens, being is neither bifurcated into clear-cut fractions of the living and the non-living, right? That is one of the consequences, because everything is alive right now. And he means ontologically, not metaphorically, by which he means whatever is affecting and affected in return in nature. Whatever changes the courses of events, it is alive. It is animate. It has agency, and nor stratified into fixed top-down rankings. Now everything is, if you will, in a horizontal plane. The same continuum, the same substance constitutes the tree, and even without breaking, it constitutes the human. Even without breaking, it constitutes the stone. Without breaking, it constitutes the building. Without breaking, it constitutes the animal, and then it goes on to infinity, right? Everything and anything. So now the buildings are on par, if you will. They are no longer reduced to automata, non-living automata, or passive receptacles. Their animate capacities and agentic potentials are affirmed. They are no longer pushed to the lowest strata of existence. Their unique being and significance now acknowledged on equal grounds with all other beings. So this means, and this is a very radical consequence, through Spinoza's hierarchical lens, architectural modalities are literally alive, right? Not metaphorically, but literally alive. So now we are moving forward with hierarchy. And before I conclude this first section, I want to talk about epistemology and ontology, their relationship, which means being and thinking, right? Because he has a very, very interesting approach to the question of mind and body as well. Still very contemporary, this question, the question of the relationship of mind and body. Spinoza argues that cosmos expresses itself through an infinity of attributes, two of which are the activities of extension and thought. Extension as in becoming embodied, and thought as becoming enminded. So his philosophy is that ontology and epistemology, and being and thinking, are inextricably coupled as some kind of an onto-epistemology, for bodies and minds always unfold in confluence. So there are no detached bodies, detached minds. They're not even separate, right? They run together. They run together. And this is the reason he became one of the earliest modern opponents of Cartesian dualism, which formulated mind and body as these two distinct substances existing independently from each other. If you recall Descartes' formulation, it is that there is a veiled hierarchy within it as well. He glorified the mind as the only locus of creative activity, assigning it exclusively to humans, of course. And he said even animals don't have minds, if you will, and reduced material bodies to passive automata, rendering nature and non-human beings incapable of non-mechanical novelty. So they're all connected, as you can see. We go back to the question of creativity. Now it is given to the question, it is given to the role of the mind over the body, right? And the different hierarchy here. So it paved the way for the dark repercussions of the Enlightenment, such as legitimizing human-centric exploitations of nature, assigning mind and reason as disciplinary overlords over body and affectivity and sensuality. Spinoza's response to this is he neither takes the side of the idealists that subordinate mind to body, nor the materialists who reduce mind to body, right? From Spinoza's perspective, we are minds, we are bodies. So one does not override the other, which is a third interesting alternative. Mind and body are simply, and now I'm reading a quote, direct quote from Spinoza, one and the same thing, conceived now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. It is as though there are these different dimensions to existence, which flow together, and two of which are mind and body. And they are corresponding dimensions of the same psychosomatic activity, but of which unfold confluently in each and every being. And again, a very radical, very strong claim, right? It's not just in humans and animals. In each and every being means anything and everything in the cosmos. There is the second scholium that comes from this for architecture. It's not just humans, but forests, tornadoes, and even architectural modalities contract knowledge, process data, and exchange information with other modalities to the degree of their corporeal complexity. Right? They may be very simple, as in comparison to some of the cognitive capacities of a human being, for instance, but it still continues with these processes. There is not an absolute distinction, if you will. Just as there is an intelligence unique to each being, there is an intelligence unique to each building, right? So through Spinoza's lens, architectural buildings express themselves through not only material formation, as is usually perceived, but also immaterial information. And this is very important, something we sometimes tend to forget or ignore. So this is his ontology and epistemology in a nutshell. Now I'm going to move on to his physics and dynamics, so that we understand how everything is built in the mind of Spinoza. He is an ardent critique of defining modalities by appealing to immutable essences and pre-given properties. Is a critique of essentialism, if you will. Again, which we only picked up after the 1980s or 60s. He rather defines modalities by unpacking their underlying potentials and their genetic processes, genetic not as in biology, DNAs, but as in generative processes, what generated something into being, right? So for every singular modality, Spinoza argues, there is an infinite chain of prior finite causes determining its genesis. an individual modality is constituted by the distribution of an infinity of simplest bodies. So I'm going to bombard you with a few physical, let's say, concepts right now. His first concept is simplest bodies, a very beautiful concept that I will unpack. But for me to be able to do that, I need to first introduce another concept, which is called motion and rest. Simplest bodies are not to be mistaken for indivisible building blocks endowed with form and structure like atoms and subatomic particles, which is still, if you will, what the contemporary physics is trying to chase after. What is the smallest, let's say, particle of physics endowed with form and structure, right? From which, like Lego bricks, that is the idea, everything in the universe is built. But Spinoza says that is not how the cosmos comes to being. Simplest bodies don't have form or structure, right? They are more so like the very transition between this underlying continuum of potentials and forms, right? So they're infinitely small, vanishing extensive quantities distinguished from one another only by motion and rest. And that's a beautiful conception. They are not different in terms of even their spatial coordinations, right? They just change in terms of motion and rest. And what does that mean? It is a unique invention of Spinoza's theoretical physics. And it means an underlying field, whose varying ratios of motion and rest result in, on the one hand, physical-dynamic formations, on the other hand, individuation processes. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. Those are very heavy terminologies. This is Spinoza because he explains it very, very simply and beautifully here. This is from his short treatise that he abandoned after a while to write the Ethics. I'm reading his quote. All singular things that are real have become such through motion and rest. The differences among these result solely from the varying ratios of motion and rest. From such ratio of motion and rest comes also the existence of our body. This body of ours, however, has a different ratio of motion and rest when it was an unborn embryo. And in due course, when we are dead, it will have a different ratio again. So you can see how he's trying to tackle both some kind of a concept that can explain any and every form of generation in terms of its physics and coming to being, but also so subtle that even in your lifetime, right? And when you're an unborn embryo, when you're an adolescent, when you're a mature person, and when you're about to die, those ratios are dynamic and they change. That's a very subtle definition. So this is a radical reversal. It is not bodies that produce motion, Spinoza suggests, but motion that produces bodies. And this is very, very important, right? Because again, going back to the contemporary physics, let's say collective imaginary, we are waiting to find these particles at the very basis of existence, subatomic particles, and we go deeper and deeper, and we think as though these particles we will find, and in their motion, in their relationship, in their, let's say, interactions, we will get to understand the cosmos. Spinoza just reverses this and says that there is first motion. There's a field of motion, right, from which all the bodies emerge. So you will never find the smallest particle because at the depths of existence, there are no particles, but there is motion. Each particular corporeal thing, this is his quote, is nothing but a certain ratio of motion. It's a very beautiful, let's say, dynamic conception of being. So through Spinoza's physico-dynamic lens, it means another scholium for architecture. Architecture modalities are no longer static forms reflecting just quantitative calculations, yeah? But it can be reconceived as varying ratios of motion and rest, expressing qualitative fluctuations. Even the most seemingly static form of architecture, right, is a different expression, maybe a very slow one, but a different expression of motion, if you will. So now we are here connecting simplest bodies and motion and rest going forward with physics and dynamics. This brings us to the question of part and whole relationships, how from smaller bodies, larger bodies emerge, if you will. And in his theoretical physics, every individual modality, through corporeal interlocking and various varying ratios of motion and rest, is wrapped in other bodies, which are then in turn wrapped in other bodies ad infinitum. This is very important for Spinoza. And you need to understand, this is the time microscopes and telescopes were invented in 17th century Dutch context. They were the ones who invented it. And he was a lens maker. So he was constantly looking through his lens, seeing these infinitely small universes, right? And telescopes, he would be seeing this infinitely large universes all of a sudden open before him. So it was very important for him to come up with a philosophical, let's say, conception that matches this new resolution, right? That goes up and down infinitely. Just as a human body is a nested composition that functions at multiple organizational levels at once, composed of organs and tissues, right? That are in turn composed of cells and molecules and subatomic particles, and finally infinitely small bodies, right? Which are the very layer of this motion that you reach, underlying motional continuum, the substance that you reach almost. A building is also a multi-scale modality composed of, say, fire bricks that are in turn composed of clay aggregates and molecules and atoms, and again, infinitely small bodies. That is where they both become continuous with one another, if you will, a human and a building. So it is through this interlocking of different scales that we arrive at the complexity of the universe. But this does not align with conventional part-whole conceptions. He somehow, I would say, anticipates contemporary developments in the concept of emergence and dynamic systems theories of the early 20th century and late 20th century, and today contemporary ones, which explore wholes that harbor these novel capacities that their parts do not possess. For such capacities do not emerge from the sum of their parts, the quantitative total of static properties, but from the interactions among their constituents and their immanent continuity with the environment, which means the emergent outcome of dynamic exchanges. So this is also very crucial. Once these parts come together, they can create in the larger systems novelties that the smaller parts do not have. So for Spinoza, he would have a very, I don't have time to unpack that, but he has a very beautiful example about a simple, small, little worm living in the blood of a human body and how it sees its environment and how it is related to, how it is analogous to how we look at the cosmos. The worm in a human body and the human in the cosmos have these similar conceptions of part-to-whole relationships, right? But there is no pure essence of humanity, just as there is no pure essence of architecture. Even the intrinsic dimensions of humans and buildings operate on emergent combinations and symbiotic coalitions. So human body in Spinoza's conception includes the worm even in your, in your blood. And we know today with the microbiota studies and what have you in our guts that we are really almost half of our cells in our bodies are not even human cells, right? They're bacteria and viruses and other cells. So there's a coalition, part-to-whole coalition there to constitute this body and being of ours. So the emergent part-whole relationship is important. But how do modalities persist over time while undergoing constant modification? This is the question of stability and change, if you will, a very big question in philosophy and in physics and biology. Spinoza argues they do so by introducing another concept that he calls potens, potentia, or conatus. Each modality, whether human, building, tornado, or molecule, harbors a unique conatus expressing its characteristic rhythms and underlying potential. So this is the motion and rest, the ratio of motion and rest, right? And the underlying potentials are the ocean that you're expressing through your wave of being. So they will be characterized within this system, if you will. Conatus then corresponds to a modality's perseverance in existence for an indefinite duration, by coordinating internal fluctuations, all these smaller parts in its body, and by surfing external oscillations within flexible thresholds, all the other things that come to its body from the environment and all the things that are in its body, right, that will be regulated, if you will, by this system that he calls conatus. And Evan Thompson, a contemporary philosopher of cognitive science, sees Spinoza's conatus as a precedent to autopoiesis, a very recent 1960s, 70s concept defined by biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela as a special capacity of living systems to structurally open themselves to incessant material flux, right? Because you eat things, right? You take in oxygen or what have you, while simultaneously retaining their singular configuration, but your body, blood pressure and, sugar in your blood and the energy levels, etc., are all regulated in your body in a certain sense, while still you're opening yourself to the environment, right? And these are done through operational closures and circular feedback systems. They call this autopoiesis. For Spinoza's conatus is even more radical, and this is an architectural scholar all of a sudden, that because of that, because it allows different conative gradations in all modes of existence, not just in living organisms. So this is no longer a biological concept for Spinoza, but it applies to anything and everything. Everything has this conatus. A mountain still remains as a mountain for a specific duration, right, indefinite duration, by keeping its bodily, let's say, chemical and physical, let's say, composition in terms of certain rule sets within its dynamic being. Not so different from any other, let's say, biological, very different from a biological organism, but still they share the same persistence in existence. So a building perseveres in its being through singular conative potentials, which include, let me give some examples, for instance, spatio-temporal affordance, there's vibration control, there's structural resilience, right? While a human being persists in existence through different conative techniques, such as self-corrective feedback systems, metabolic sustenance, and complex cognitive operations. Beneath these singular differences, what buildings and human beings share are conative capabilities that sustain their persistent individuality, right, through homostatic perseverance, while ensuring their continuous individuation. They change. Buildings also change. However, slowly they change, right? We renovate them. They're destroyed. We change their function through heterodynamic openness. So they're also open to change up to a certain extent, while still keeping some of their structural qualities, etc., etc. This means a modality is not a rigid, bounded entity on which external events secondarily befall. Rather, and this is very important, a modality is a modification, right? So a modality is not modified secondarily, but these are the same terms weaved from two different perspectives. Such a beautiful approach. It is no wonder, and in his books you can see this literally. He uses modality, which is modus, the noun, let's say, form, and modification, which is modificatio in Latin, right, and the verb form, as synonymous notions throughout his work. Sometimes he would use modus, sometimes he would use modificatio. So modality and modification, individuality and individuation, being and becoming, as is more usually used in philosophy, are different dimensions of one and the same activity for Spinoza. They are not opposed. You don't choose one over the other. It's not that being comes before becoming or becoming precedes being, right? They are one and the same thing, two different sides of the same thing. They usually overlook this double character of modalities, especially that of non-organic ones. And again, another scholium, and assume, for instance, that a building is a static and unchanging construct, crystallized and frozen form, right? Yet through Spinoza's conative lens, an architectural modality is both a consistent individual, an active construct, a subject, which means a noun, and also a continuous individuation, a constructive activity, an event, a verb, right? Both simultaneously. Okay, so that's the physics and dynamics now. We made all these connections. Now we're moving forward to ethics and aesthetics. So an individual modality never resides in a vacuum in Spinoza's perspective, but is always coupled, multiplied, and penetrated by a myriad of others. So up until now, we talked about the cosmos, and now we talked about the individual in the previous one. Now we're going to talk about relationships, right? We were bracketing this up until now, but the interactions will be very important for Spinoza, without which you cannot think about any individual being. In addition to its intrinsic rhythms, therefore, all these ratios, all these smaller components in your body, organs, and what have you, a modality is also defined by its relational capacities and interactive potentials in the same breath. So Spinoza unpacks these interactive capacities with two concepts. Now I'm going to introduce affection and affect. These are very important. Affection, which is in Latin affectio, is the interactive relationship, which is very simple, in which a modality's action is enveloped by and transcribed in another modality. So I see a building and I register the visuality of it in my body, for instance, right? Or I touch something, which is the same thing in a different register of sensation. Humans, animals, plants, buildings, planets, we all encounter and interact with one another by way of affections. Affect, which is affectus, is the ensuing increase and decrease in one's agentive potentials due to enveloped affections. So we first have this relationship with another thing, and then depending on whether it gives us more life, whether it gives us more potentiation to do certain things, whether it gives us more joy or sadness or what have you, the changes in our body, the changes in our being, right, after this interaction will be defined as effects. So effects are modifications in our power of existence as a result of everyday interactions, yes. Let me run over this again, because these terms are very close to each other and usually confused in the literature. Even we today have effect theories, Deleuzian interests, etc., etc. Even there, I see them all the time, mismatched and confused. Then we encounter a building, we come face to face with a painting, or experience a musical piece. These interactive relations, this one, right? This very thing between us, themselves are affections, whereas our becoming more or less potent in being engulfed by that building. We are disgusted by it, or we are all of a sudden, invigorated after experiencing this building, being transformed by that painting, being moved by that musical piece are effects, right? So effects are, if you will, vertical. Affections are more horizontal in a sense. So this will be very important for us, because Spinoza will constitute his entire ethics and aesthetics on these two concepts. Spinoza suggests that an individual modality's capacity of being and acting is increased in relation to an affective encounter. Then the cause of this empowerment becomes good for the affected modality, right? So if this relationship gives us more life, gives us more potentials to act and be, then we consider this relationship good, right? And this empowering transition can be called an effect of joy. And Spinoza will use these casual, everyday terms. He will redefine them, just like he did with God, right? That this is one of his tactics. He will find these concepts that are very widely used, and he will, restructure them in his philosophy. So all of a sudden, we have the concepts of good and joy with respect to these encounters and interactions and empowerment, if you will. By contrast, if a modality's capacity of being or acting is decreased, right, all of a sudden, or restrained, limited, then the cause of this weakening becomes bad. Again, becomes is very important here, because nothing is good or bad in Spinoza's philosophy objectively, but it becomes good, it becomes bad. Just like a saltwater fish, right? If you put it in a lake, right? It will be bad for it. It won't be able to live. It will restrain his life. It will die. So that's a bad encounter. It doesn't mean the lake is evil. It means it's a bad relationship. It's a bad affection, if you will. And this weakening transition can be called an effect of sorrow. Then it will be, it will experience sorrow. It will experience weakening of his being, if you will. So in simplest terms, these are no longer emotions for Spinoza, as you can see. They become these new concepts. Joy becomes becoming important, potentiated in relation to a good encounter, and sorrow is becoming weakened in relation to a bad encounter. These are the new definitions. So all of a sudden, we have all these different concepts now related to affection and affect, from which Spinoza will define more than 50, 60 different forms of affects. He will talk about love and anger and any kind of, affective capacity that you can think of within this system. It's a very beautiful part. It's especially in the part 3 of ethics, if you're interested in. So his grounds his unconventional ethical aesthetics on this affective setup. He argues that ethico-aesthetic values, and this is very important for a designer, an architect, and any human being, if you will, are neither fixed qualities possessed essentially by objects. So he goes against objective ethico-aesthetics, nor private judgments projected arbitrarily by subjects, subjective ethico-aesthetics. Objective ethico-aesthetics being something like Mona Lisa painting is beautiful, regardless of whether you like it or not. Right? It's objectively beautiful. That would be an argument. Or one can say, well, taste, changes from one person to the other. So it's subjective. It is, capricious. We cannot even establish any form of ethic or aesthetic discussions because it's very, random. Right? That would be the other way. See, Spinoza would argue against both. He says rather that ethico-aesthetic values are relational, neither objective nor subjective, but relational, which means there are agencies in both sides of affective interactions. This means affective ethico-aesthetics grounded on reciprocal exchanges and ensuing modifications. How these relationships play out will be very important for Spinoza. So it means this affective ethico-aesthetics does not operate by obeying transcendent moral laws that come before you, right? Or pre-established aesthetic rules, but by experimenting with open field of affective interactions. Because if ethics and aesthetics are based on relations and affections and interactions, and if both sides are dynamic, then the only thing you can do is really to experiment and see what kind of outcomes that arise, while being very cautious, of course. They can be dangerous, these experiments, right? So when Spinoza boldly remarks, and this is something Deleuze likes to remind us in each and every one of his books and lectures, nobody as yet this is Spinoza speaking, nobody as yet has determined the limits of the body's capabilities. That is, nobody as yet has learned from experience what the body can and cannot do. When he says this, he emphasized that a body's capabilities can neither be determined in advance, right, nor be fully exhausted. That is the experimental part. With each experiment, there will be sometimes new, let's say, novel ethico-aesthetic values and relations arising from it. So we cannot know what a body can do. To give an everyday example, since bodily capacities are actualized in relation to other bodies, which means I cannot know how deep I can dive or how much I can love, for they do not depend solely on myself, but are emergent outcomes of my interactions with the sea and the depths, and with the individual I love, and the affective relations in which we are enmeshed, right? And this is why today we still have apps like Tinder and what have you, and you just go and meet someone, and you can be disappointed by it because you can never know in advance. You just need to see the relations, the affections play out first, yes? So a very beautiful concept. So now we're going forward with ethics and aesthetics. Now we talked about relational ethical aesthetics as opposed to objective and subjective. So this means effective experimentation is a dangerous ethos. So this is not just free for all. It doesn't, I hope it doesn't sound like this very liberal, let's say anything goes, let's experiment all the time, right? Because it can open us both to joyful and sorrowful encounters. So you need to be cautious. You need to experiment, but you need to be cautious. So it gives you a very tricky dilemma here. That's why Spinoza suggests we need to move and pave our own paths, moving away from the bondage of passions toward the freedom of action. So two new concepts now, passions and actions, and what they mean in a nutshell. Passions are passive effects caused by external affections of which we are not the adequate cause, making our affective states reliant on powers outside ourselves, leaving us at the mercy of fortune. So it means you are not contributing to the event that is in front of you in such a sense that you are actively generating your own joy in the process. You're dependent, let's say, to an external source. And if that source is taken away, then your joy will be taken away from you. And every form of sorrow will be external, of course, from Spinoza's viewpoint. Even the ones that we inflict on ourselves, they are delusions. They're delusions. We are confused, and we are trying to weaken ourselves for no reason. So instead, he suggests active effects, or which are called actions, which are the same thing for Spinoza, that spring from our own agentive patterns by becoming actively involved in constituting empowering compositions ourselves, by extracting joyful potentials from each encounter, or by doing justice to what life brings at every turn. So in each and every event, right, you are trying to find these commonalities, these compositions that will empower you, and try to avoid the weakening, let's say, encounters, which is as simple as even food. For some of us, there will be some allergies. For some of us, the same food that you will go and eat in a dinner with your friends will be bad for you, but not for everyone else, right? Because it's not about only the food, but its relationship with your body, to go back to his relational ethical aesthetics. So he argues we can transform passions into actions and constitute empowering composition with other modalities insofar as we can compose commonalities. And this is an important concept. You need to find a common channel with something else so as to be able to transform it with their singular rhythms and affective capacities. Again, I'll give you an everyday example because these are high concepts when they remain with their formal definitions. For instance, when we first encounter the sea, right, just the casual, you're in a beach, you encounter the sea. You first absorb the dynamic rhythm and affective capacities of the water in your body as a passive effect. At this stage, you go into the water, your body is receiving it, but at this moment, you are still passive with respect to this relationship. Then, if we can find an adequate commonality, as Spinoza says, an effective confluence, a rhythmic attunement with the ebb and flow of the waves, we can transform that passivity into activity, which means we can then swim rather than submerge and drown, right? Forming an effective confluence with aquatic forces, because those two are both possible. If you cannot really find your commonality, the commonality between your body and your rhythms, and the commonality of the waves and the wind and the sea and its depths, if you cannot find it, you will have a sorrowful affection. You will have a passive relationship, and you will submerge and drown. And it's in life and death at certain, even in certain relationships. Otherwise, you will enjoy, you will swim, you will surf. It will be a beautiful relationship, right, with the sea, if you can do that. So such is for Spinoza, the ethical aesthetics from the viewpoint of life, to evade and endure bad encounters as much as possible, while increasing and sustaining good ones, and to transform passive effects into active ones, to affirm our effective potentials to the fullest, and to go to the limits of what we can do. So this is the passions and actions, or passivity and activity part. Spinoza grounds such effective journeys on a very peculiar concept that he calls free necessity, which sounds just as usual, very weird. He will never choose. This is a certain tactic of Spinoza, in case you have not recognized yet. He will take two opposing schools in a philosophical, let's say, session, and he will find his own alternative. He will show that those are not opposed. There's a third way. So this is the freedom or free will on one side, and necessity or determination or fatalism on the other side. One of the biggest discussions still today. Do we have free will? Is the universe mechanical, right? Etc., etc. So he will have this beautiful concept called free necessity. A third position against both free will and supernatural belief in final causality, and fatalism at the same time, and passive retreat to mechanical causality is a third position. What is this? Like surfers who attune to commonalities between their own capacities and the rhythm of the waves to chart their relatively free path on the fly in accordance with the necessary unfolding of aquatic currents, we all surf what life sends our way in free necessity, wave after wave, with fluctuating ratios of activity and passivity, right? Which means you have the freedom to manipulate the necessity that comes at you up to a certain extent. It is usually very limited, but up to a certain extent, insofar as you find those commonalities, right? That goes back to the question of passivity and activity. And the final part of this, the final and shortest section of this, will be the elegance of Spinoza's ethico-aesthetic system, which lies in the effective synthesis of the self and the collective and the cosmos itself. So, because it is not an individualist system at all. That's the beauty of it. For each aesthetic, for aesthetic intensifications and ethical emancipations can be forged only with other modalities through our underlying continuity of life. Even with those examples that I gave about the surfing, about swimming, right? It is never about the individual. It is about finding commonalities with things around you. So, so the individual and the collective and cosmic, those three need to be always in play with any kind of ethical or aesthetic gesture, Spinoza's point. Becoming active at the expense of rendering others passive, becoming free at the expense of enslaving others, becoming intense at the expense of diluting our affective milieu shared with others, are always misled, right? So there is no myopic, let's say, position here. For in proportion to each modality rendered passive, enslaved, and diluted, our affective milieu and the cosmos themselves suffer. And in third, we suffer ourselves, because remember, this was a very continuous system, right? It is not a separate, individualistic, atomistic system. So everything is connected and continuous underneath. In that sense, you're always trying to not only empower yourself, but everything in your reach and the cosmos, if you will, as much as possible, because they're all three different dimensions of one and the same continuity. This is Spinoza's subtle way of rendering personal ethico-aesthetic journeys immanent to, now we know what this means, intrinsic to and continuous with collective and cosmic activations, rather than reducing them to egoistic pleasures or myopic self-interests. So through Spinoza's effective ethico-aesthetic lens, the path of potentiating your individual fluence is always paved together with enriching the lives of others and life's expressive fields in cosmic confluence, right? And this is very important. And this is why he's becoming more and more relevant today, if you will, in the 21st century. So for architecture, what does this mean? This is the symbiotic ethos brought forth by Spinoza's philosophy. And this gives us a question. This is a question, actually, and it's not a rhetorical question. It's a very difficult question that we all need to think more and more about. And that is how to design architectural modalities by interfusing individual empowerments, collective joys, and cosmic worlds. How to do this? We usually remain only at one level, at best two of these, 1.5 of these, all three of which are very difficult for us to think about. So that's the end of the ethics and aesthetics. Now I need one last section to bring this home, and that is the question of enmeshment, technology, politics, and ecology, very shortly, each and every one of them. Spinoza posits that individual beings, whether humans, spiders, flowers, buildings, what have you, are not self-contained entities, but enmeshed modalities. Right? So just like things are enmeshed within your body and constitute you, your enmeshment with other things also constitute the cosmos. Yeah, and this is what he says. This is in the Emendation of the Intellect, one of his early books. He says, I'm quoting him directly. Everything that exists in nature interacts with other things, he writes, and the meaning of which he clarifies in an overlooked footnote. And no one talks about this overlooked footnote in Spinoza's scholarship, which is very, very sad because it's such a beautiful one. He doesn't talk about interaction in a very weak and basic, let's say, banal sense. Look at what he means. In the footnote, he explains this. To interact with other things is to produce or be produced by other things. So there's such a strong definition all of a sudden. It's not just this, I'm already produced, and there's already this produced other object in my reach, and we have secondarily interact with each other, right? It is that in our interaction, we produce each other. There's such a strong definition. So when he says everything that exists in nature interacts with other things, it means everything that interacts with each other produces and produced by each of these contributions, right? However infinitesimal, however minute that effect can be, it still defines you. It still changes you. It still changes the way you think and be. This means modalities do not pre-exist, but are co-produced by their enmeshed compositions, right? So all of a sudden, this becomes very important when it comes to questions of technology, politics, and ecology. Our meshes are not external to us. This is not the mesh. The mesh is from inside of you to inside of them, right? It is this line that becomes this. The mesh is this one, you know, but continuous with our modifiable existence. So we all expand and contract ourselves by way of our enmeshed coalitions. We all view our milieu with affective webs of our own. You can think about yourself almost like a spider, if you will. Your webs with other things are part of your being. So this is a very, very important contribution. Now, this has considerable technological consequences, right? Because he argues that if multiple modalities share compatible rhythms of existence, remember his concept of motion and rest, it's certain ratios, they come to constitute an expanded modality for the duration of their operational coupling. So as in, when you ride a horse and your relationship with the horse, they become one in such as in terms of the transportation, in terms of the movement, such that you create a third individual, human horse, let's say, enmeshment. That we can talk about. There's an emergent whole out of that relationship. And the important thing about this is that buildings are the same, right? When we relate to buildings, we create a larger whole with ourselves and the buildings, not an extrinsic relationship. And that's the important part. They become part of ourselves. Whenever we engage with technological formations, we extend our modality, which means our being, to the effective limits of our emergent enmeshment. So if you're using glasses, you would know this very well. They're not just gadgets. They extend your being. They extend your capacities of seeing, right? Technical objects and architectural buildings, so this is a scholium, therefore, are not external gadgets. We multiply our capacities of existence with and through them, you know? Through Spinoza's technical lens, architecture becomes our exoskeleton, if you will, our spider web, our non-human becoming. And this is very important. What we architects shape then are not just bricks and stones. We shape each other's extended modes of existence. And this is such a big responsibility if you come to think about this, right? Whenever you build something, whenever you construct something, that that will become part of someone else. Hence, architecture's immense potentials and vast dangers, because this can then be abused very easily, as it has been in the history of politics by certain regimes, how they use architecture symbolically to manifest their own power structures, right? So technology now becomes an extended being of your body. Social political enmeshment is another focal point to Spinoza's writings. At a time when Europe was dominated by hierarchical regimes, Spinoza, which are in absolute monarchies, if you remember 17th century, your history books and European history, right? God-given kings, and then you have the serfs, and you have the people, you have the aristocracy, and what have you. Spinoza conceptualized a heterarchical political organization that he playfully called absolute democracy, and he's a very sarcastic philosopher at the same time. You can immediately sense he makes all these beautiful, beautiful conceptions. Absolute democracy, look at the term. Just he puts it against absolute monarchy, right? As opposed to it. That is why Spinoza's political vision was received with such hostility in his time. In the year of its publication, Spinoza's theological political treatise was defined by the Dutch Reformed Church as the most blasphemous book ever written. Yeah. So he wrote this book and he published it anonymously, because if they were to catch him, they would burn him at the stake, like Bruno. If you know the history of, if they don't know the history of Inquisition in Europe. According to William Carroll, an 18th century Anglo-Irish high church divine, Spinoza, quote, fundamentally subverts all natural and revealed religion, overthrows our constitution both in church and state. Right. So it's no longer just a religious problem. Spinoza becomes a political problem now. According to White Ludwig von Seckendorf, a 17th century German court official, so this is a secular figure, as you can see, right? He undermines not only religion and theology, but threatens to liquidate all royalty. Of course he does, right? Because he's talking about absolute democracy. Everything is horizontal, just like he thinks about the cosmos. And according to Pierre Yuan, a 17th century French Calvinist, Spinoza not only destroys theology, but also instigates everyone to political rebellion. That's why, for instance, Jonathan Israel, one of the historians of early modernity, is recently revising that history and saying Spinoza was maybe the leading figure of French Revolution, even though his books were always read in underground circles, never as explicitly as the others like Diderot and what have you. So it is no wonder, and he says, this is what Israel says, it's not in Voltaire or Rousseau as conventionally considered, but in the developments of Spinoza's radical politics. And indeed, in the 1960s, if you know how Spinoza was recently resurging in political theory, theorists like Louis Althusser, Antonio Negri, Etienne Balibar found in his work the theoretical equivalent of self-organizing desires of erupting in May 68 and all the bottom-up movements since then, and attempted to realign their radical political theory and practice away from representational party-based organizations, just like communist parties and state-run organizations, right, towards bottom-up collectives. Spinoza was the philosophical figure who they could use to move themselves away from the orthodox Marxist line. So as such, Spinoza's absolute democracy is far more radical than representational democracies of today, because democracy today is also a very tired term, the way that we are using it, right? In that what Spinoza argues is directly constituted by the distributed agency of all socio-political actors who self-organize themselves on common grounds, on those commonalities, while retaining their unique differences and potentials. So it is no longer a representative system that we are used to. Okay, let's move a little bit on, because I think we're getting late. So the architectural scholium for this would be His radical political theory can also help us reconcile the agentive distribution in architecture, as the established architectural tradition of assigning hegemonic agency to clients, state apparatuses, top-down planning initiatives, and even architects, who we sometimes imagine ourselves as almighty creators, right, result in unnecessary hierarchical formations that suppress the generative potentials of diverse, multiple spatial actors, only some of whom are humans, if you will. So through Spinoza's heterodox political lens, alternative experiments become viable, with which we can affirm the constitutive agency of all interacting agents in co-determining the built environment. This can also give an interesting lead. And the final part is the ecological enmeshment, which is the web of life through which everything is connected for Spinoza. So that's why he says God or nature, right? Nature is this cosmic, let's say, enmeshment. He was one of the first moderns to oppose dominant Enlightenment discourses, bifurcating culture and nature, the human and the non-human, the built and natural environments, if you will. His work is full of elaborate critiques, warning against concealed hierarchies within such bifurcations, which elevate human culture outside and above non-human nature. That's why, for instance, he's not on the same page with Descartes and other moderns, because they would always create this they will oppose God-given hierarchies, but situate humans at the top. And he would say that is not the case in nature, right? Everything is on par. They are not exceptional modalities over and against nature, Spinoza counters, but life takes into account, and this is the very beautiful quote, I'm going to read it, not of the human race only, but of the whole of nature. Right? Again, this holistic lens. Humans, another example from one of his private letters, humans, like all other things, are only a part of nature, right? They're not dominants, they're not monarchs, they're just a part, a humble position. So we live, and animals are no longer lesser beings, as this is from Ethica. In the animal world, we find much that far surpasses human sagacity from time to time. It doesn't mean they're superior, but it means, depending on which kind of capacity you can talk about, animals sometimes can surpass you. Plants are no longer subordinated as well. So we live all as extensions of a common ecosystem. All of a sudden, all these connections become part of the system, right? Grounds that all that we are, as distinguished as humans and non-humans, as culture and nature, as cities, forests, deep oceans, on equal footing. And that's his most radical, perhaps, conception, that nature and culture are not even separate, but constitute a nature-culture continuum. There is much more to learn from this today, especially in architecture. 3.5 centuries after Spinoza, we are learning through bitter experience today that situating ourselves over and against nature and turning architecture into an instrument of mastering nature, right, has led to almost destroying not only ourselves, but the entire planetary ecosystem. We cannot address critical questions of ecology today by holding on to our anthropocentric, which means human-centric, vanity, and keeping nature's bifurcation with culture and architecture intact. It can no longer be done with this. And it can no longer be resolved with, ecocentric, let's say, seemingly eco-sensible certifications or quantitative calculations or what have you as well. There's a qualitative problem here. It's not about reducing carbon outcome from 40% to 27%. That won't solve anything, right? I mean, it's better, of course. Yeah, it's a progression, but it is about your relationship with nature in its cosmic sense. Spinoza hints at different potentials, such as affirming nature's heterogeneous continuity, dizzying equality, it really is dizzying, and distributed generativity, of which we are a singular yet continuous part. So what can we do with this in architecture is, again, an important question with this. How can we move away from the misconceiving the profession as a technocratic endeavor, self-absorbed with subjugation of nature? How can we do this? And reorient architecture as a planetary practice, leaving symbiotic experiments from within the generative fabric of nature architecture continuum. So that's the end of it. I hope you could follow. I had to go a little bit fast, but that is how Spinoza's philosophical system is built, brick by brick, right? All these concepts, you bring them together and you create the ontology and epistemology. All these little concepts come together and create as physics and dynamics, and affections and passions and necessity and ethics and aesthetics, and then the question of enmeshment and technology and ecology, after which you constitute these modules, and then they're all related to each other, and then the entire cosmovision, if you will, is laid bare. Let me not do the epilogue and conclude here so that we can have some time for questions and answers. Thank you for listening.
Gökhan, thank you. That was an incredible tour de force, extraordinary, and incredibly clear. I mean, absolutely crystal clear. It was. Don't apologize for anything. I'm just wondering. I think Sanford Quinter is here. Whether Sanford would like to add a few comments to that. I don't want to put you on the spot, Sanford, but it's great.
Hey,
to
man,
see.
that's okay. Let me say, first of all, I lost control of the clock. I woke up in the middle of the talk. I am totally wrecked, but I really feel like living after what I heard. I have to tell you that. First off, I want to say a fantastic lecture, possibly, oh no, absolutely the best one I've heard of Gökhan now in at least 6 years. A level of synthesis, shall I say, a level of relaxed synthesis, I should say, that I can't believe that in a way one has achieved right now in 2024 with respects to somebody like Spinoza. In other words, Gökhan and I started teaching this type of material 6 years ago, and I, like a coward, shall we say, or perhaps whatever, like a weakening human being, had lost hope in a certain sense that this type of recovery of a historical understanding could ever be re-engaged or reactivated, if you like, in the context of the illiteracies that we are cultivating so much these days. Anyway, today's talk was fantastic, at least the parts that I heard. However, I just had a couple of things I did want to challenge Gökhan with a little bit, because I see incredible amount of synthesis taking place where, and I think this is very, very important for any theorist and philosopher in a certain sense, is to, and first I have to say, I like the word enmesh. I like it a lot better than other words, which I won't mention, which many people use in that place. And which I think are extremely misleading. So I want to say that. So in terms of how the work can be, how the ideas can be inserted into the existing discourses, that's really what I want to get to. Okay, I talk too much, especially before I've had my coffee, etc. I don't know where the hell I'm going, but I know where I'm going here. There are two things. Number one, in the parts that I heard, certainly, and in the integration of a comprehensive, or shall we say, an uncompromised, I don't know, I don't want to use this word, but I'll say it once and then I'll move on, probably find a better one, immanentist or integrationist or holistic, shall we say, understanding of being, especially one that explicitly integrates the entire physical universe in which all existence actually takes place. We know there are many other dimensions, and that was beautifully laid out. I just want to pause at one more thing, and that is to say, sometimes I still heard in this incredibly beautiful Spinoza thing, Gökhan is still, in a certain sense, occupying the historical Spinozist position. And what I mean by that is the way we talk sometimes about Jesus, and the sense of like, is there a historical Jesus, and then is there the Jesus of the texts? I'd like to say that on the Spinozist side, it seems to me, ever more hearing what Gökhan was presenting today and the emerging synthesis, I believe that we do need to get beyond the tacit limitations of the historical Spinoza and really begin to get to whatever that other Spinoza is, right? The Spinoza of the text. And what I mean by that is super simple. There remains a bias because of the tradition, the human tradition in which Spinoza was, and the historical human position in which he was saying, to have not yet discovered, shall we say, a language or a full cosmo slash, position. Now, here, I'll get there, guys. I'll get to something very, very clear. That is really no longer simply talking about the enhancement and the amplification of us, but rather the application of our entire universe itself. So, who I think has a guy who I think has managed back, I think this probably in the 1990s, maybe the 1980s, to have come up with a single sentence, incredible challenge. This is a philosopher in Norway named, of course, Gökhan knows him very well, named Arne Næss, who in his late years became a very, very committed Spinozist. And he's also the founder, many people will know, of the deep ecology movement. This is one sentence that is such a favorite of mine, but really tells us how to turn the corner. And it is the following, quote, through self-realization, humans can become part of the ecosystems of Earth in distinction to becoming only themselves. Mm-hmm. So I leave that. I mean, I don't think you have to say much about that, except simply to acknowledge that concept of self-realization and the way in which we keep that word self around. And thinking of it, what I mean by that, it's evolved. The idea of becoming part of the ecosystems of the Earth, and essentially, can you do philosophy? Mm-hmm. Can you do work? Can you produce work? Can you innovate? Can you produce, as Gökhan beautifully was putting it, by retrieving that incredible phrase of Spinoza, telling us that our job is to self-reproduce, and to produce our world in that production. Okay, that's number one. I wanted Gökhan to speculate a bit on that. And the second thing is this, and Gökhan and I have had this a years-long difference, shall we say, in debate, and that's on the question of technology, which, and I'm not going to go into this in great deal. I'm simply going to say, Gökhan gives, shall we say, a deceptive and charming example of eyeglasses and how they help us get through our goddamn lives in the city and everything. But I do want to point out that a proper and sophisticated and responsible approach to the technological problem would have to acknowledge that eyeglasses may very well do that, but they generate, naturalize, and legitimize the value of focus, which is also a massively limiting and ultimately, you could almost say, a treacherous counterforce that ultimately also, it limits how we think, it limits how we perceive, and it limits how we will understand the self-realization posited by Næss. So that's it. That's my overly. That's what I want to, and I just want Gökhan to respond to it, because I think he has crossed the Rubicon into the 21st century Spinozism, of which I don't know anyone else who has. Since I've read some very wonderful books on Spinoza. I try to keep a little bit up to Gökhan when we teach, but I think the 21st century problem is a great one, and I'm really impressed at where he brought us today.
Thank you, Sanford. Yeah, we've been teaching with, he's my partner in crime for the last 6 years at Pratt. So it's beautiful to hear these things from you. And two very important subjects to clarify. I think I did underline it, but perhaps my focus was more on the individual at the beginning. That's why you felt the need to bring it home, that the co-production happens, not in the individual, right? And in terms of the question of ethics and aesthetics, but it is always becoming one with the universe. So that is Spinoza's ultimate ethical or aesthetic, let's say, journey that he lays before us. And that is very important for me to talk about them together, not one opposed to the other, because there are many traditions, just like you talked about certain problems with technology, which I will come in a second and talk about it. There are also certain religious, mystic, let's say spiritual traditions, which have also been abused in the sense that you lose yourself in becoming one with the cosmos. You transcend yourself, for instance, and that concept is also very differently used in many various traditions. But for Spinoza, the point is this: it is not by sacrificing yourself for the greater good that you reach it, or vice versa. It is not by becoming this self-centric individual and you reach your self-realization at the expense of diluting the power and weakening every other thing, but it is together, right? That is the co-production. That's why I wanted to talk about the ethico-aesthetic triad of the self plus the collective plus the cosmos. Thank you for reminding us Arne Naess. For those of you who don't know Arne Naess, he was the founder, if you will, of certain traditions, one of which is deep ecology in the 1970s, the other of which is ecosophy, like a philosophy through the lens of ecology, if you will. And he was incredibly influenced by Spinoza. So you can even find in the 1970s some of the most philosophically rich ecological discourses. Spinoza's traces already, they rediscovered them immediately. In terms of the question of technology, yes, we have. Sanford has a much more critical conception of technology than me, and I try to put my position, just like Spinoza usually does, into a third alternative, which is neither technophilia, an uncritical, naive embrace of technology, nor technophobia, a certain way of thinking that the technology is the antichrist, right? It will always be reducing our relationship with our environment. The question, the third position I'm usually trying to develop, and not only thanks to Spinoza, but lately more so with Simondon. Maybe we can do another session in the future on Simondon as well, and his understanding of technology is that how can, and that is Simondon's phrase, which is a beautiful phrase, how can we find ways to become friends with the machines, in the sense that mutually empowering each other. Is there a way? Because Sanford's example about the eyeglass is of course true, and he went for a very difficult example. We can just easily say the gun, right? Humans have capacities to kill each other. We can do that with our own hands. We can do that with small weapons. But when you think about the machine guns, when you think about the nuclear weapons, when you think about what we do to each other with the help of technology and how easily it becomes, how massive it can become in a second, right? You can immediately see the other side as well. So the point is not that, and that's why I talked about, when I talked about architecture, I said we have very big responsibility because it has a lot of potentials and a lot of dangers insofar as you have this extended being. So the question would be how to make sure that our relationship with technology is also in line with ecological empowerment and is a way to, let's say, becoming one with the cosmos. And I think Sanford is very cynical about this. He thinks there is no way. There are other ways, but technology is not maybe one of them. Whereas I think it might be one of the possibilities if we can be critical at the same time. And yeah.
That I'm good. I completely agree with you on that point. I think we need to find some sympathetic engagement to this. Maybe I'll just pick up on that question of the lens, which I think is absolutely kind of central. I mean, just as I don't mention the fact that Spinoza was a lens grinder, had a job as being a lens grinder, and somehow the notion of the spectacles, of the glasses, the microscope, or whatever it is, the idea of the gaze, somehow, in my mind, permeates his world. And I mean, I thought this was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating presentation. And of course, there are echoes of so much that we've also discussed in other sessions that have came out. Deleuze, Varela, and so on. Andy Clark also is the back of my mind in some sense, and recent other things. But one of the things that really struck me from a kind of personal perspective is the way that, and as you were talking, back of my mind, it was in my mind, as it were, the logic of emergence and the logic of swarm intelligence, how you reconcile the individual and the many, in a beautiful, beautiful sort of way. Now, to my mind, emergence is one of the most extraordinary, powerful, and interesting terms out there, but also in some senses the most problematic, in the sense that you can observe it. We've seen, John Holland was making observations, but even scientists they're really struggling, or especially scientists are really struggling to explain it in some senses. And the sense I got, and this from this beautiful lecture, is absolutely beautiful, was that really what Spinoza was incredibly good at was observing and commenting and identifying and really articulating very precisely relational conditions and so on. But maybe at the back, underneath it all, wasn't fully explaining things and is somewhat elusive in some senses. I mean, a bit like Deleuze himself in some ways.
Of course, yeah.
And is that a fair criticism, or am I? I mean, I think it's wonderful, but that seemed to me the kind of.
But I need to hear your critique of emergence. Do you think it is abused, or what kind of problems do you assign to it, so that I can answer?
No, I don't have any problems with emergence. I'm just saying, I think it's an extraordinarily rich and powerful concept. But my problem is that no one's really been able to really explain it.
I see, yes.
You can observe it, you can see the murmurations of starlings and all these things, amazing things in nature, but everyone's struggled to really explain it.
Right.
And I think that would be my
yeah.
I mean, we are talking about an individual who died very early, and he died very early before
There's a very beautiful and very sad moment in which one of his friends in the private letters asks him about a question about physics, and he talks about it a little bit, and then he says, there's a future physical treatise that I will write, right? And I will explain all of them there. But then he dies in his 40s, I think 45. And he dies because of the lens, Neil, which is ironic and beautiful at the same time, because grounding them and inhaling it, right, leads him to his death. So it is, in that sense, like a martyr of philosophy and science. In that sense, it is also beautiful. But yes, we are talking about an individual who lived before Newton almost, produced his physical treatise. before, Darwin. We are talking about, this was the very early emergence. Descartes was just there, and, Bacon was there, and Hobbes was there. And the early scientific tradition was in the very incipiency, in its embryonic form. So, of course, all these terms, and Friedrich Engels made a point, for instance, for some of his examples. He said that for the concept of smallest bodies, right, because it sounds a bit vague what is going on. He says that Spinoza was generous enough that he came to the limits of his science of his day, and then he gave us some placeholders, right? He did not try to go further than that. He gave us some placeholders with which we can in the future, fill in the blanks, while still being, while still doing justice to his philosophical system, which will not even change almost. It is, if you read his philosophy, it is incredibly uncanny how relevant it is in terms of emergence, in terms of ecology, in terms of politics. That was the reason, when I first, I remember I was back in Istanbul before coming to Cornell. I was reading Ethica, and I was struck. It was like a tornado. And I remember, I don't even remember what kind of search engine we had back then, maybe Yahoo, maybe this is more than 15 years. I remember writing Spinoza and Architecture, actually, because I was thinking, oh, there is an incredible potential for politics, for ecology, for, existence, for ontology, for epistemology. He has all of these things. He's not like one of those philosophers who is very interesting in metaphysics, but has a very conservative, politics or something. He has all of them. And then I remember there was no result. And I was like, what is going on, right? And maybe that's also one of the questions we need to think about this. Apart from, right, some of the limitations that he had with his day, what are our limitations as architecture with respect to reaching out to this individual? And we have hundreds of books on Kant's and, Heidegger's and all these philosophical figures, but Spinoza somehow still to this day remains elusive, right? There's a self-critique. Maybe we should do more about our profession as well.
No, I totally agree. I just wanted just one small kind of follow-up in some ways, in the sense that I think the lens is such a powerful concept to deal with here, in terms of, in a way, we are reading Spinoza through a lens of other Deleuze and Valéry, more recently. But there's also an architectural lens that's in operation, and is there a risk of a certain violence through that lens to the work of
for sure. I mean, every secondary literature that you're going to read, if this is very interesting for you, of course, after listening to this, you should really go back to the source material. Every secondary literature, you read Rebecca Goldstein, and it will have a moral lens. You will read Wolfson, one of Spinoza's most important secondary lit figures. It will have a very historically, let's say, rich lens. It will bring together Plotinus, and it will bring together Jewish history, etc., etc. So we all bring in our own lenses, of course. And me, as you could see, I am trying to also push it more and more towards architecture. What can we do, not only in general with Spinoza, but also in the worlds of design and architecture? Is there, because this is a huge missed encounter, and what can we do? And those are my questions, all those scholia, 11 scholia, right? Hopefully you all got your own questions and confusions and associations with it to go forward with. And the multiplicity of lenses, of those lenses, may cater for perhaps a new renaissance, hopefully, in the coming years.
I think it's the problem, in a sense, we saw with, well, both the problem and also the contribution of Delander in terms of Deleuze. We got very much Delander's Deleuze, but it was super clear, but it was also a lens in some sense.
I mean, personally, as you could see, I thought with Sanford for a long time. I taught with Delander as well at Pratt. I have my own history with Deleuze, so all those things contribute to it, right? But but also these are the figures like Sanford and Manuel, that come closest to Spinoza by way of the laws, and sometimes by way directly with Spinoza, because we don't have anything in architecture, right? We don't have a history. So it is. I'm honored if you found traces of those, rather than, you know, finding as a problem for myself. But yeah.
I was want to ask some of the audience a second to ask their question. Just
Yes,
kind of
please.
small follow up. I mean, so the thing I find so intriguing about DeLanda especially is how people like Graham Harman think they're talking the same language as
Right.
DeLanda, but I know that DeLanda doesn't think the same thing.
Yeah.
So how would you position Triple O against this kind of Spinoza view of the world?
Right.
This is the new materialism, or whatever you call it, of DeLanda.
Right. Well, yeah, I read that book between them. They did that talk at Pratt, you know, Harman and Manuel. I think there are superficial similarities, but in the fundamental way of things, they're very, very different. To give you a very, very short summary, from what I understand in Graham Harman's system, objects precede any relationships, right? So it is as though you have a very atomist, almost like a Lucretian system, in which there are these different atoms which secondarily relate to each other. So all forms of ethics, aesthetics, politics, they all arrive afterwards as a second thought. And that's why there will be some, you know, let's say for them, some potentials for, if you're suspicious about this movie, or some problems at that very beginning gesture. Whereas, as I could talk more about in Spinoza, and this is, you know, this is very unique to him. This is what Deleuze got from him, and entirely built his system and updated his system on that, which is there is an underlying continuum, right? And that underlying continuum, I will give you the word, Sanford. Give me 1 second. There is an underlying continuum, which then condenses and then becomes, with its agitations, these overlying the individuals. So it is no longer even continuity as opposed to, or preceding the individuals or the objects, but they are one and the same thing. It's again like the field theory in physics, right? You have the fields, they become the individuals. So that's why I usually give, and that's an example from heterodox Islamic philosophy, actually, the ocean and the waves. The waves and the ocean are the same thing, right? Just from, the waves are just partial expressions of this. This would be very, very antithetic to the object-oriented ontology, if you will. This continuity, this relationship already intrinsic to anything and everything, this cosmic relationship already the generative, let's say, source of things, right? So I think we can just start from there, and then there will be a lot of differences following as a consequence of this, but I think that makes it clear at least where they stand. Yes, Sanford, you were saying something?
You know, honestly, I wasn't really going to say anything that, I feel a bit embarrassed to say this, but I know that given the forum that has been created here by Neil and the type of tension and the audience, I do think it merits saying a couple of things that most people don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's brutal, perhaps, but I feel like I should say it. Number one, I was in touch with Manuel throughout the time that he was doing the book with Harman. And I think everybody should know that not for a second did he do it with a first degree enthusiasm. It was, frankly, an incredibly cynical project that he did. He felt that it would simply gain him access to an audience he would not normally ever have gotten. And he told me it was one of the most difficult things in the world, not to pull his hair out or to launch insults in the opposite direction. And number two, in other words, it was, you know, he doesn't regret it, I know, except that he apologized endlessly for doing it. And there was never a second did he feel he was actually engaging a worthy position. Number two, I want to say is that I taught that very book they did together in Vienna one semester. And it was an incredibly painful thing to do. But I felt that at the time there was still a bit of interest in triple O among architects, especially in Europe, because there also had been a moment of a couple of years in which artists and the art schools had been interested in that. But all I wanted to say by way of, you know, a thing is that at the end of the course, I felt I had to give an apology to the students for doing the book. And I want to say is that I got a standing ovation for my apology and not at all for the course. And I got to say that it should not, nobody should assume just because Harman, for example, wants it that way for there to be a bridge and an overlap with relational and anti-relational philosophies. There is not one. It is dishonest in the extreme to suppose that there is one, or even to try to build that architecture, if you like, which would legitimize or justify the hope or the belief that there is a link. There is no link. There is no legitimate accommodation of one by the other. They are exactly opposite, and one is extremely retrograde. That's to say, the isolationist object metaphysics is absolutely the opposite to the universe that you described today, that Spinoza is trying to give birth to. And the last thing I want to say is I did read a comment in the session today by, I believe, an Iranian woman who is asking a lot of questions about mathematics and rationality. It's important, I think, for any listener, especially since Spinoza is so difficult to read and not that many people will ultimately do it, is that Spinoza, among Spinoza's constraints, if you like, on his thought, and it's one of the most interesting things in Spinoza, is his absolutely firm 100% commitment to rationalism and his ability to have juiced the rationalist lemon enough to have created this extraordinary lemonade, which is completely and totally post-rationalist. It's my thought. And I wouldn't mind if you commented on that, Gökhan.
No, you already beautifully summarized that. He is, yes, usually confined to the three rationalists of his time, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, in philosophy departments. They are taught together, but yes, he pushes reason. And that's why even if when you read his epistemology, he starts with imagination. He has a tripartite system. He moves on to reason, and the reason is the one in which you find those commonalities. For instance, swimming, right? For him, he doesn't mean reason as though some kind of you go back to your ivory tower and think about mathematics and geometry only, right? Or philosophize with logic. He means the reason that you can find with which your body and the water can come together. So for him, even the question of reason is an ecological question, a physical question, if you will. And then he moves on to the third one, in which he talks about becoming one with the cosmos. And the third one is intuition. So which is for some reason always ignored by these stereotypical characterizations. And the intuition plays, if not equal, sometimes even more weight, more gravitas in this philosophy, in the sense that without intuition, you cannot really become one with the cosmos or the events that you are part of, whether it be a banal concert, seemingly banal concert in which you become one with the dance and the rhythm and the music, or much more intense, let's say, becomings from time to time, and you think about other forms of interacting with the universe. There are other questions as well. May I read some, Neil, from the comments?
Maybe we can get Mitra to ask her question, since she was the one referred to. Mitra, would you like to?
Yes, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your wonderful lecture, which was really of a sophisticated level. My name is Mitra. I graduated, Mitra Allah Maradi. I graduated with a PhD in architecture from Eastern Mediterranean University of Cyprus. I have two questions. One of them is, did Spinoza criticize the use of mathematics and measurements in understanding the nature, while he stated his point of view, or his view that all things must be understood to follow from the law of the nature. As far as I know, I mean, even God, in his point of view, is the sum of the natural and physical laws of universe, not centrally, I mean, an individual entity and or creature. And while nature seems to organize itself according to mathematical laws, so why was he critical of the use of the math? It was my first question. And second one was, since Spinoza developed an pantheistic, anthropocentric philosophical system in which God was identified with nature, can his philosophy be related to ancient aliens or extraterrestrial, while he believed that God cannot be an individual entity and creator? Because as far as I know, in the past, we believed in multiple gods that were also related to the nature, especially in maybe Greek and Greek goddess, or for example, in Mithraism, we believed in multiple gods. So this is just a question in my mind about Spinoza and his, I mean, belief about God. And one more thing was, can we consider him? He was a religious atheist, something like that, because we can maybe call him, or he was an atheist at the same time he believed in God, but a different meaning of the God. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, in terms of mathematics, he famously used a geometrical method, but it's just a way of organizing the book of Ethica. His relationship with mathematics is very peculiar. He never talks about laws of God in the sense that we talk about today, but more in so as the possibilities and potentials of the cosmos and how they come to being, right? He doesn't talk about fundamental laws of physics or anything, and which were not yet discovered at this time as well. His relationship is usually, for instance, the only part that he specifically talks about a mathematical problem in Descartes, in the commentaries on Descartes, he talks about Descartes' solutions and relationship to mathematics a lot. He has this very, very famous letter on the infinite, in which he talks about misconceptions about the concept of infinite in its geometrical, mathematical, and philosophical senses, and then he brings forth a new conception of infinite, which was then taken on by Cantor, Georg Cantor, the German philosopher and mathematician, who with that brought forth the set theory, if you know set theory, and transfinite numbers. And he had this conception of finite, transfinite, transfinitum, and infinite, absolute infinite in Cantor. And that system he took from Spinoza, for instance, and he writes about it in his own text as well. So he influenced geometry and mathematics to its expansion, not to keep within the Euclidean system, but he was already, just like Sanford's characterization, he was within that system, but he was already pushing it to its post-rational position as well. In terms of God and nature and ancient extraterrestrials and aliens, correct me if I'm wrong, you are trying to make a connection between multiple God systems of the early, let's see, antiquity, and how they might be perceived as ancient extraterrestrials or aliens from your viewpoint, and then trying to understand whether Spinoza had any conceptions that can subscribe or support that. I mean, if you're not talking about some conspiracy theory, if you're talking about multiple gods or multiple modes of otherworldly existences, Spinoza would not satisfy you, because he is talking about not even a single God, because God becomes nature, right? In that sense, rather than going from one God to multiple gods, his big problem is, how can we make God immanent to nature? How can we take it from its supernatural dimension? And how can we make it the very richness, the very dizzying generativity of this cosmos? How can we recall that God? And in terms of religious atheism, there have been so many in its reception. Both poles exist. That's also what makes Spinoza interesting. Some people think, this is from Novalis, for instance, they call Spinoza a God-intoxicated man. It is as though he cannot talk about anything without mentioning God on one hand. And on the other hand, you saw some of the receptions of his philosophy. Everyone is talking about him being the most atheist, developing the most atheist position, or the most the position that is most antithetical to religion or spiritual systems. I mean, both terms are very, very charged, so I wouldn't be interested in going into that. But all I can say is, this is his system. He thinks that God is immanent to nature, right? And there are certain spiritual, let's say, traditions in heterodox Christianity, in heterodox Islam, where, you know, for instance, El-Hallaj, you would know, right? El-Hallaj and Ibn Arabi, in which God is this universe, is this nature. So you are God. When El-Hallaj said, "En el-Haq, I am God," he doesn't mean he is the supernatural God, transcendent and extrinsic to this world. He means, insofar as God is this universe, the creative powers of this universe, and it runs through me as well, hence I am God. You know? So in that tradition, you can find, in Taoism, they are recently discovering more and more very interesting indigenous cosmovisions, right? In which everything becomes sacred by way of their connectivity. So you can find that footing there. But whether you're going to call that religious, spiritualist, atheist, that is up to you. It is desacralizing of a transcendent dimension for sure, but also you can say it is sacralizing, right? It is enchanting everything that exists in this universe at the same time. So it sounds, yes, as usual as Spinoza, it sounds contradictory at first, but it's a beautiful third position, both to the religious and the atheist positions, if you will.
That was a beautiful explanation, a beautiful response. We've got two questions in the chat. I hope you're too popular, Gökhan, but so hope you're okay for those two more questions.
I'm
Ram,
good. I'm good.
Good, great. Ram, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, please. So thank you for your nice presentation. I really enjoyed to listen to that. And I'm Ran. I'm from NTU Delft. I'm currently doing PhD there. And I have a question which is related to, as I type it in the chat box, like I feel when you talked about the Spinoza's understanding of human and nature, it's just give me beeping tones in my head, like it shows lots of similarity with lots of, for example, Chinese philosopher like Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi, like Taoism. They also talk a little bit about the nature and the culture. And my question is, like, I feel struggle to position myself when I talk about, say, for example, when I use this kind of idea to understand the Chinese traditional architecture, for example, garden, say, I don't really want to use Spinoza as a, for example, language to talk to Western people. Like I also struggle with how I position like Spinoza and the Chinese body of philosophy, which is showing that their understanding of nature. So yeah, that was would be my question. Like, how are we going to position for non-Western scholars or architects? How are we going to position ourselves, associated with Spinoza? Thank you.
Very beautiful question. Yes, brings in the question of the Western and non-Western. Now, this was a lecture on specifically on Spinoza. When I usually do lectures, I tend to bring all these different thinkers together as well. So I have this very intricate system that I have been working on for decades, I can say now, in which there are different trajectories, one of which is the conventional, for instance, transcendence-driven, hierarchy-driven, Western, but you can also find it in other traditions. For instance, in Islam, in Orthodox Islam, you can find those. For instance, certain Confucian philosophies in the Far East, you can find those. So every society has its, let's say, allure to transcendence and hierarchy from time to time. Sometimes it becomes the dominant, sometimes it is suppressed, and so you have Parmenides, you have Plato's, Aristotle's, Kant's, Hegel's, and all this tradition, Descartes and Newton's, and come until the reason I talked about Stephen Hawking. Even he argues about certain anthropocentric principles as though they are part of the cosmos, with the anthropic principle, if you know their arguments. And architecture has been a part of this a lot as well, the mainstream architecture. On the other hand, I am trying to trace a heterodox lineage, right, in which Spinoza is part of it, but not only the leading, let's say, figure. So yes, I study Taoism, for instance. Your intuitive insight is very, very spot on. I teach all three. I teach Lietzi, I teach Lao Tzu, and I teach Zhuangzi, all of them together, right? The triad, for instance, in Taoism. And Heraclitus, for instance, if you want to go into the European tradition, is part of this. Upanishads, I find certain parts of Upanishads very, very interesting in coming up with these conceptions. If you want to go to antiquity, in Islam, heterodox Islam, I already talked about Ibn Arabi and al-Hallaj. You have some figures who really went the immanent way, and they suffered. I mean, al-Hallaj, I don't know if you know this, but he was decapitated, he was burnt alive, his hands were, cut, etc. So this is a very dangerous path, especially in the past. And then you come to more modern philosophies, in which you can find a lot the likes of Ferdinand Whitehead. So the most popular, perhaps, in architecture schools, thinkers like Gilles Deleuze in the last 30-40 years attaches himself to this tradition as well. So lately I was talking about cosmovisions of the indigeneity in Amazonian, let's say, philosophies. You can find this very, very interesting conception of the forest and becoming one with the forest that is being studied in the last 20-30 years. For instance, Ailton Krenak is a name you can trace in terms of an indigenous voice talking about this kind of approach to the question of existence. So you need to, I wouldn't be able to talk about how you can navigate that space, but my way of navigating it is to bring together this puzzle, which is not given to us. You cannot really find a book in which all of these figures are thought and studied together. You can find a very linear Western hierarchy, transcendence-driven history, all these figures, but the other one we need to construct ourselves, unfortunately. That is what I'm trying to do. And Spinoza is very crucial in there. But also all these other philosophers. And hopefully you can, Taoism is such a beautiful philosophical system. So hopefully you can find your voice within that as well.
We have another question in the chat from Vasco. Vasco, is it quiet there? Can you read it out, or no, you can't? Okay, let me read it out. And you'll see it in the chat.
Okay.
How does Spinoza's philosophy challenge hierarchical structures within architecture, such as the prioritization of form over matter, or humans over non-humans? Good question.
Right.
Beautiful question. So form, matter, an Aristotelian dichotomy and hierarchy, right? In which form is the generative component and matter is this passive inner thing which needs some kind of molding and shaping from the outside. Again, you can see, I didn't go into Aristotle, but it is similar to Plato in the sense that there is this hierarchical superior generative agency, which is form, right? And architecture has been in that line for a very long time, very formalist driven, if you will. Yeah. And matter is this, chaotic, Play-Doh-like thing, which just awaits for some kind of command from the outside. Whereas with Spinoza, as you could see, anything and everything in the cosmos, any kind of material composition is already agentive. Right? So it doesn't really need that external composition. So form-matter relationship is no longer this kind of transcendent hierarchical relationship, one charged with activity and generativity, one with passivity, right? Whereas now it becomes a dance, just like the dance of substance and modalities. It becomes a dance in which they have different, if you will, roles, but it is no longer a hierarchical setup. And in terms of humans over non-humans, well, it is not an anthropocentric system, right? It is a cosmocentric system in which you no longer have, and that is one of Spinoza's strengths. Because all the moderns that were coming at the time that were going against the Christian doctrine or the Jewish doctrine, the religious doctrines, the scholastic modes of thinking, let's say Descartes and Hobbes and Bacon's, Spinoza saw that they were not really instigating a revolution as is usually studied and taught at, let's say, humanities schools, right? But they were instigating a coup d'etat, in the sense that they were removing God from the throne so that we can put ourselves on that throne, right? It was a change of God to the human kind of approach, no longer theocentric, but now anthropocentric, let's say, worldview. Whereas for Spinoza, humans and non-humans are, their relationship is no longer hierarchical in that sense. Yes, there are different complexities, there are different singularities involved, and certain capacities you can do very well, certain they can do very well. So you no longer have that oppositional, neither oppositional nor hierarchical of relationship. So he would be a very important source if you're interested in these two topics to be able to channel into your own, let's say, repertoire, to challenge them and come up with new ideas about.
We got 2 more questions that's appeared in the chat. Now you're doing, Gökhan. You're a victim of your own success. We've got Michal. Michal Yus has got one, and Gustavo one. Michal, do you want to ask yours quickly? Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Gökhan, for this fantastic lecture. This was really wonderful, inspiring. I will watch this several times over. Thank you also, Sanford, for your comments. I remember we touched upon this issue of technology last year, and this was also great. Well, let me see where I'm going with this. I was reminded during your lecture that Rosie Braidotti once said that she thought that if Spinoza was alive today, he would be a programmer, like a coder or like an AI researcher. So I was thinking about Spinoza in a sense as like let's say, a philosopher of alignment in that way, and relating to this current sort of discourse of AI alignment, which I think that actually Spinoza is very informative from that perspective. And yeah, I guess for me, I suppose that from that perspective also, like when Simondon said that there is no robot, and I think there is no robot for Spinoza either, right? There cannot be, in a sense, I think, a robot in Spinoza's framework. And I think when we think about how to integrate or how to relate to artificial intelligence today, Spinoza makes it clear that right, there is, how do we think about this in a non-hierarchical way, or in a way that we don't, yet we are creators of something without imposing on something. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts, Gökhan, in that regard. Thank you so much. This was a beautiful, fantastic lecture.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I will just add a footnote to Rosie Braidoti's update. Insofar as he's perceived as a hacker, right? Maybe I can go along with that rather than, let's say, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur sitting in his desk like an Elon Musk type. I cannot envision him in that way, unfortunately. So in that sense, yes, subverting the system through ways of different modalities of technology that we have today in programming and artificial intelligence might be interesting. Now, the question of robots or androids, I'm teaching a course, an elective this semester at Pratt called World Building at the intersection of philosophy, architecture, and fiction, in which I had a class on Philip K. Dick and Blade Runner, right? In which I first talk about his own. He has a book called Philosophical, Comments or Letters or something like that, in which he has these interviews and everything, and he talks about his own biography, and he talks about his influences, and he talks about Spinoza again and again and again. And the beauty, if you remember the original Blade Runner, not Villeneuve's new one, but Ridley Scott's, and the very book, Do Androids Dream of Electronic Ship, right? The problems there are that now the Earth has this catastrophic event. We have really damaged the Earth so much that everywhere become a wasteland. Our relationship with animals and plants, we almost obliterated them all. And now we created the robots and the androids. And we are still trying to create this enslavement, let's say, scheme in which there's a corporate structure and they are still trying to do whatever we want them to do. And if they are trying to come up with their own agency and voice that they also are beings, right, on par with us, we kill them, right? We terminate them. That's the entire sub-story there in that sense. And if you remember that beautiful moment in the movie, which is not part of the book, Rain, the Tears in Rain monologue. Do you remember that very final moment where the antagonist, the final android, is just giving this speech after saving the human, right? And says, you need to see through my eyes. I see all this beauty and I see all these things. And so in a sense, the point of the book is that the androids are alive as well, or can be alive as well, right, on equal grounds. Now, again, this is a beautiful and hopeful point, but remember Sanford's immediate critical gaze about this, and also remember think about. I would ask you to think about the current scheme in which all these AI systems, the banality with which they are used, the reductive systems that they are aligned to, the ways they are abused and become part of disciplinary systems and commercial, let's say, systems so quickly. So we need to be very careful. There is that possibility, right? There is that possibility of commonality, of being on par with them, becoming friends with them, using them to empower ourselves, but also seeing the agency in them, not just a single, self-centric thing, but also to flourishing of both at the same time. But then there are all these other scenarios which are much likely, unfortunately, given the asymmetry of power in which we live today, that there are also very dark paths. So we need to be very careful. Again, that is against Simondon's position that I repeat, which is how to evade both technophobia and technophilia, and how can you really reach the very mode of existence of the technical being, right? And how can you then, if you can see potentials, how can you then become an ally to be able to reach the richness of cosmos together, if you will. Hopefully we can do that.
Could I just chip
in? Thank you.
Quickly there. The Rutger Hauer, who plays
yes,
that figure in
he improvised it. He improvised it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not in the script.
Yeah, no, it was. And what he says actually about the movie was, he said, in the end, Blade Runner was not about replicants. It was about what it is to be human. And I think in some senses we can probably use AI. Now, I always think about this anyway as a tactic, as a mirror in which to understand what it is to be human. But what a
Or
nice
intelligence. Thinking about artificial
exactly.
intelligence, what is natural intelligence? Yes.
Exactly. So I always use the term alien intelligence in order to de-anthropomorphize it. And I think in some senses, our problem with, or many people's problem, is they continually look at it from an anthropocentric viewpoint. And really, we need to step outside of that and use AI as a strategy, a mirror to challenge our own perceptions on things.
And maybe just to add a very short thing, maybe the balance that would be to really read the cosmic intelligence that is out there as well, the ecological intelligence, right? The mushrooms and the trees and the animals and what is out there, and then balance it with artificial intelligence and then human intelligence. From that triad, from that triangle, interesting things will pop up. Insofar as you're very, myopic and tunnel vision into one direction at the expense of others, I think it will always lead us to problematic, let's say, dead ends.
Absolutely. Gustavo, we're running out of time, but do you want to quickly ask your final question?
Sure. Thank you very much, Gökhan. It was a really interesting lecture, very tour de force. I think my question comes from more of a scientific lens. You actually quoted quantum fields and information. And I think those are the basis of how to understand everything. And we have Nobel laureates, I guess prize winners in physics here for string theory. So I think my question would be, we're going from an age from bit to qubit for quantum computer. How do you see, I would say, Spinoza guiding us into understanding what it is to be a part of a continuum of everything in the cosmos?
What a beautiful question. Thank you.
Sorry, through a research lens.
Oh, how can we do research with respect to this lens? Research as in scientific research, you mean, or design research?
I would leave it open-ended to you.
All right, I see. Well, the first part of the question is that I'm trying to keep myself up to date with what is going on with the brain theories, with string theories, with different, candidates, right? Because there are so many right now, and none of them are really fully established. The ones that I find closer to Spinoza, I try to trace even further and deeper. That is why I talk about both the conventional classical field theory, right, in physics, and then the quantum field theories and how they relate to Spinoza. And the reason they're interesting is because they start not with particles, but they start with fields, these underlying fields, which are not even, one, but multiple. And then from their excitations, from their condensations, if you will, there emerges even the micro scales that we can perceive, right? Yet then again, those fields are even mathematical up to a certain extent. They're trying to argue for this, but they're like matrices, right, in a spatial temporal continuum. So physically, whether we can reach this underlying substantial level, or will we always be doomed to infer from it, is a contemporary question for science. Spinoza thought that was, that is a real dimension and that we can really explain it and intuit it, not perhaps scientifically and quantifiably prove it. In terms of the research, that's a very tricky question that I need to think about, because the research that I do for my own is not usually scientific research, but either philosophical or architectural or some kind of humanities-based research trajectories, in which Spinoza becomes one of the guiding, let's say, lenses with which I look at things and how they align with sometimes creative, very, very creative oppositions also are very rich as well.
Yeah. Why do I say? Why am I saying this? Is that when I hear some of these physicists talk, there is a point where their math can't compute, their imaginations compute. So they leave it to the unknown, and they will not say if the unknown. They don't want to name the unknown as God, right? They want to leave it without definition. So I think for me, looking at research at this extreme level, and maybe it goes back to the humanities. We have to believe in something, a direction or a motion. And no matter what the experiment is, we discover something new, if we can even recognize it. So then when I go back
starting with an intuitive leap and try to see if it leads
yeah,
to...
yeah. So I think for Spinoza, what I'm understanding is we're basically filters, and we're always changing and we're flowing within this constant movement. And then we become, we're in this middle of this state where we're just always in action, but our minds aren't aware. So that's why I was very fascinated with how you spoke today, because I keep thinking maybe Spinoza can offer guidance to these scientific researchers looking at the edge of science that has no name, that has no definition, they're struggling with their imaginations.
Yeah, very good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to bring, I mean, for me, it's more about bringing together not just the scientists, but then the artists and the writers. I would find Virginia Woolf and how she talks about becoming a mist in the middle of London, for instance, right? That I will take and talk about in terms of a Spinoza's, let's say, mode of thinking. Then I would talk about scientists, then I would talk about philosophers and Taoists. In an untimely way, you can zigzag back, jump back and forth and try to collect all these intuitions, because yes, in the end, I wouldn't put it in the word of belief, perhaps more in terms of intuitive experiments, but in that sense, yes, there will always be certain things that will evade our capacity to reason immediately. So rather than remaining within those limits, but that is also what the interesting theorists in physics also would do, also, of course, right? That is how they run their hypotheses. But you're right that they have a very different method, which is sometimes more constraining, and they might need some imaginative and intuitive fuel from time to time to make the leap.
I was about to say, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Frank Wilczek. He wrote a book called The Beautiful Question, Finding Nature's Deep Design. So he actually talks about quantum.
Thank you very much. I write this down. Is he a popular science book writer, or is he a really hardcore
he actually helped win the top prize in science with string theory. I think he was 19 at the time as a graduate student or a PhD student. But I think the book talks about different levels of beauty when you think about quantum fields theory. And I thought about you.
No, that's great.
That was
I'm writing this down. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no worries. But I just wanted to say thank you again for the wonderful lecture, and thank you, Neil and Sanford. Very stimulating today.
And thank you also, Michael, who was responsible for setting this whole thing up. And Gökhan, this has been amazing. I've never heard you before, but this is a real eye opener. I think. I'm always astonished by what comes out of Turkey, and you are you remind me of another polymath, Memo Acton, and I think there's an incredible possibility there, which I think we'd love to hear more from you and bring you onto a Digital Futures platform in more capacities, also possibly on our Turkish language channel, because we do have that as well. And and certainly I think there are many other things that we could think about, but it's fantastic to really get a glimpse of this. And the only thing I would say is that, a bit like Memo, I searched you on Amazon. Your book isn't out yet. There has to be. There has to be the book, right? And I hopefully maybe a zone book. I don't know if Sanford was listening to that, but it really, this is what we need to see and to have out there.
Push for, yeah.
Such a beautiful contribution. I don't know how you're going to put a limit to it, because I don't know how you're going to put a limit to anything that we do. And indeed, putting a limit to our own session today is a big challenge, because it could proliferate everywhere, and hopefully it will continue in many other manifestations. But I just want to thank you. This has been such an incredible session, opening up so many ideas and connecting many of the previous ideas that we've been debating. I was thinking about Sanford's own discussion about Varela before, and all these discussions with Andy Clark and so on that's been happening, and the work that Andre's been doing on process-based philosophy. all of this kind of it becomes part of this beautiful picture. No, I'm saying beautiful is the wrong word, but incredibly useful and vital and important outlook. What an amazing session. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you
all
for having me.
Thank you. Well, please come again. And thank you to everyone here for the questions, and the team behind here who aren't even with us right now, but who'll be working behind this. There is a whole machinery there. This will be uploaded onto YouTube. Come back again, Gökhan. Maybe we can have a node in New York. We've got a Delft node, which has absolutely been terrific.
We should for sure.
About how we can proliferate this and really extend it, because it has such a rich potential for the whole community, not just architecture, but the whole kind of our whole academic community. Unbelievable.
Thank you.
Just to say, in 2 weeks' time, we don't have a session next week, but we have Vera Buhlmann, who's here with us today, who will be giving a session on Michel Serres, which we look forward to very much. Wow, fantastic. I'm going to go off on my surfboard and go and enjoy the ocean after your comments.
Right.
Just one
becoming
final
one with the ocean, right?
Yeah, something that John Rackham once told me. I don't even notice that Deleuze refers to surfing, right? And he refers to surfing because the surfers were fascinated by the concept of the fold. I think they maybe understood the fold, but there's something now. I shall now think about surfing in the concept of Spinoza too. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you.